The UK introduced the Statutory Residence Test on the 6th of April 2013. It's called the Statutory Residence Test, but the reality is it's a series of tests that help to determine whether you're considered to be a UK tax resident or a UK tax non-resident. In terms of why that's important, if you are considered to be a UK tax resident, the starting point is you're taxable on your worldwide income, but if you're a UK tax non-resident, you're taxable only on your UK sources of income. So for example, if you were leaving the UK and you were going to be working somewhere that's in a very low tax jurisdiction and you were carrying out all your work outside of the UK, that income, if you were a UK tax non-resident, would fall outside the scope of UK taxation. Now, in terms of the Statutory Residence Test, while it's called the Statutory Residence Test, it is actually a series of tests to help determine your residency position. And it's broken down into sections. So there are 3 possible tests for considering whether you would be considered a UK tax or automatically non-resident in the UK. We have 3 tests to consider whether you're considered automatically resident in the UK, and if you're not automatically non-resident or automatically resident in the UK, we then have to move to something called the Sufficient Ties Test, which looks at how many links you've got to the UK and how many days you've been in the UK. So in terms of the automatic non-residence tests, the first 2 tests are very much based around day counts. So from HMRC's perspective, you are considered to have a day in the UK if you are present there at midnight at the end of the day. The first automatic overseas test is if you've been UK tax resident for 1 out of the previous 3 UK tax years. And if that applies to you, then you will be considered automatically non-resident in the UK if you have spent fewer than 16 midnights in the UK, or 16 days. If you've been non-resident for the previous 3 years prior to the tax year being considered, then that day count gets increased to a maximum of 45 midnights. And once again, you'd be automatically non-resident if that would apply to you. The final test for being considered automatically non-resident is something called full-time work outside of the UK. In terms of that, you've got to make sure that you are working for the whole tax year full-time. Full-time from HMRC's consideration is more than 35 hours per week. You can't have a significant break from this full-time work outside of the UK. A significant break is where 31 or more days go by and not one of them is either an overseas work day or would have been an overseas work day but for annual leave, parenting leave or sick leave. The other criteria that you've got to stick to is no more than 30 work days in the UK during the tax year. So a work day from HMRC's perspective is any day on which you work for more than 3 hours during the day. So for example, if you were in the UK on holiday and you just happened to check your emails for an hour or so during the day, that wouldn't be considered to be a work day. But if you were looking to come to the UK for a meeting for the purpose of work, then there's a very strong likelihood that that would be considered a workday from HMRC's perspective. So no more than 30 workdays and no more than 90 midnights during the tax year as well. The final rule, which doesn't apply to most people, but you mustn't be an international transportation worker with 6 or more journeys to or from the UK during the tax year. So those are the automatic non-resident tests. In terms of being considered automatically resident in the UK, the first test is do you spend 183 days or more in the UK during the tax year? So we're looking at 183 midnights or more. Effectively, are you spending at least 6 months in the UK during the tax year? The second test is known as the only home in the UK during the tax year. Now for this, we're looking at a 91-day consecutive period, of which only 30 days need to fall within the tax year. And during that period, you only have a home in the UK, other than homes outside of the UK, which you spend fewer than 30 days during the tax year. And you've got to make sure that you're spending at least 30 days present at that home during that particular period. But this is something that maybe catches people who are in the position of relocating either into or out of the UK during the tax year. The third automatic UK test is known as full-time work inside of the UK. So it's quite similar to full-time work outside of the UK in as far as you need to make sure that you are working for at least 35 hours per week. You need to be undertaking at least 75% of your work days in the UK. Again, you can't be an international transportation worker with 6 or more journeys to or from the UK during the period. But the key difference between full-time work inside of the UK and full-time work outside of the UK is for full-time work inside of the UK, you're looking at a 365-day period, of which only 1 day has to fall within the tax year. So once again, for people who are relocating into or out of the UK during the tax year, this is something that can really kind of catch people out. If you're not considered to be automatically resident or non-resident in the UK during the tax year, we then have to look at something called sufficient ties. And the reality is, I can't kind of give you an answer in terms of whether you would be considered resident or non-resident by means of sufficient ties, given that we could be here all day. However, if you've been a UK tax resident in one or more of the previous 3 tax years, there are 5 possible ties to the UK. Those ties are family, which is a spouse, civil partner or common law equivalent, or a dependent child. We've got accommodation, which is where you have accommodation available to you for 91 consecutive days during the tax year, and you spend only even 1 day in that property. It's extended to 16 days spent there if it is a family member, or the accommodation of a family member. You've got a work tie, which is when you work in the UK on at least 40 days during the tax year. You have a 90-day tie, which is where you've spent 90 days in the UK during either of the previous 2 tax years. And then you've got a country tie, which is when you spend more time in the UK than you do in any other country during the tax year. If you haven't been UK tax resident for either of the previous 3 tax years, then the country tie gets kind of discounted and ignored. The main thing to be aware of in terms of the sufficient ties test is the more ties you have to the UK, the fewer days you can spend in the UK without being considered to be a UK tax resident. But really, if you are at the point of considering sufficient ties test, I think it's probably sensible to reach out to a tax advisor who can provide you with some more guidance on that. If you need any help, please feel free to get in touch with us.